Hello, friends. Welcome to the School Transportation Nation podcast. I'm Tony Corbin, the publisher of STN. This episode is brought to you by TransFinder, the leader in school bus routing software. Our tech tip today is brought to you by Zonar, and safety tip is brought to you by SafeFleet.
Hello, everybody. Our nation is expanding out there. Welcome back. I'm Ryan Gray, editor-in-chief of School Transportation News. I wanted to extend a late happy Father's Day to all those fathers out there. Tony, I hope you had a great Father's Day weekend.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Same to you, sir.
Stay tuned because in a bit, we're going to be hearing from Michael Shields, the Director of Transportation at Salem Keizer Public Schools in Oregon. He's got nearly 5 decades of experience in the industry to share with us, as well as some great in-depth comments about this whole COVID-19 thing.
Yeah, excited to hear from Michael. He's always a speaker at our conferences. He's always packed his classrooms, and he's a fountain of knowledge. So really interested in hearing more on his insights. All right, Ryan, let's get into it, man. States have been releasing their new plans, but there's been some pushback. You want to give us an update on what's going on out there?
Yeah, so previously we've talked a little bit about some of the state plans that have been coming out. And in a couple of those states, there's been comments regarding physical distancing, social distancing, if you will. I like to call it physical distancing. A lot of states are saying, yes, we need to social distance on the school bus. And we've heard all these stories about how that's going to reduce the number of passenger capacity. But some of these plans are making statements that are saying, if possible. So one of the previous podcasts I mentioned that, a lot of these school attorneys are really going to have fun with some of this language. And sure enough, we're starting to see actually some states start reversing some previous guidance that they've issued or mentioned about reducing passenger capacity on school buses because of physical distancing. One of the states, which actually has yet to publish their official guidelines, is Kentucky. But news reports coming out of there indicate that a recent call with some school administrators with the state have revealed that apparently amid all of these concerns about the costs increasing because of additional routing and runs that are going to be necessary to shuttle and ferry these kids back and forth if you can only get 10 kids on a bus, the state's actually saying that it's unrealistic and too costly to social distance on school buses. And basically they're saying the students have to wear masks. And it sounds like they're considering having routing as normal. Hearing this from other states in districts as well, Texas issued some guidance this week saying the same thing. So was curious about how this was going to play out. And it certainly seems to me that at least in some areas that we might not see too many differences on the school bus in terms of the number of kids. Again, if you're talking about urban areas, some of these real, flashpoint centers of COVID-19 activity, I think we're gonna see a lot of reductions. But certainly, it's seeming to look like in some states and maybe some rural areas, anyways, school districts are going to try to kind of skirt these physical distancing requirements.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was talking to someone earlier a bit about, how do you tackle the issue of physical distancing? And they said, easy, increase the walk zones, right? Change that footprint. So I'm not sure how far that looks and what that means, but I'm sure our listeners are considering all scenarios with respect to how to manage this new challenge.
Definitely, yeah. Extending the walking distances is always one of the first things that the industry implements. And we've seen a lot of this because of budget cuts. After the Great Recession in 2008, we saw a lot of that. That was one of the main ways to address a lot of the reduction in school bus service. So certainly school districts are looking at those. Some state plans are looking at those as well. I think also the length of the school bus rides could be an important factor when determining social distancing or not. Obviously, from things that we're hearing from the health experts, the longer that a group of people are together, the greater the risk of exposure. Another big factor is where these districts are located. Like I mentioned just a few minutes ago, some areas in the nation have not seen the COVID-19 cases that other places have. And some states have already reopened, so to speak, their communities and economies and whatnot, like in Idaho, North Dakota, Wyoming, some of those states. But then we always have to balance this with, as we're seeing more and more of the states reopening, we're seeing a lot of the COVID-19 diagnoses and cases rise. That's certainly happened in Arizona and Florida. We're seeing some of that in California. A lot of states are dealing with that right now. But one thing that's pretty interesting I read last week was when this whole thing broke in earnest in March, there were a lot of early reports that New York City public transit was fueling the outbreak, at least in that part of the country. That came from a study done, and that's being now debunked, showing that actually there was a lot more of these large gatherings that were the reasons behind those outbreaks. And it wasn't, a packed commuter bus or a packed metro train going through New York. So if anything, it shows us that perhaps in a transportation environment, at least, there is a chance anyways that COVID-19 might not spread as fast as if, say, we're having there's outdoor concerts or the movie theater. If there's a lot of people in close proximity, dinner parties, people are talking and engaging with each other. Now, of course, the school bus ride is a lot different, right, than the metro train in New York City. A lot of commuters, they have their headphones on, not that kids don't, but people are reading the paper, they're sticking to themselves, they're not really, having a wild party on the bus. A bunch of kids are a lot different. So there's those concerns as well. But it was a pretty interesting article about that. So again, I think we'll just see how this thing plays out in the coming weeks. And as, again, states continue to open up, what does that affect on the number of COVID-19 cases and how are school districts going to respond?
Yeah, I know you in the July issue that you guys should be getting here not too far off soon. You wrote an article, Ryan, on the cleaning as well as some of the other innovations that are happening on the school bus in terms of maybe air purification in the cabin of the bus. Maybe that's some integration with AC. There's, plastic guards in between the seats. There's the addressing of chemicals, what's safe, what's not, what's recommended. There's just so many iterations of what people are doing, what they can do, and what's safe. And I think also they have to keep mindful of not selecting something out of panic that they don't have access to those cleaners and they get something that necessarily could be detrimental, if Johnny puts his mouth on the seat, because God knows that will probably happen. But just making sure that the cleaners and things that are being used are safe for the kids on the bus.
Certainly. Yes, exactly. Just so much to chew on right now for school districts. Definitely, they have to do their homework. I think that's the biggest thing that's coming out of this is to do your due diligence. It'll be, again, really interesting to see the recommendations from this STARTS task force.
Yeah, technology is innovating very quickly. And our tech tip this week is brought to you by Zonar, a leader in smart fleet management. Like students, drivers and staff can rust a bit over the summer. As you prep for restart and reconfigure fleet operations, have them brush up on fleet tech they use with web-based training, how-to videos, users guides, and more, all online, all free. For tailored instruction, Zonar also offers online courses your people can complete at their own pace. Learn more at zonarsystems.com/restart. That's zonarsystems.com/restart. So Ryan, the situation with schools restarting, prepping for the new year, releasing more plans, recommendations, guidance, what are readers telling you?
Well, a lot of readers are telling us that concerns about the driver shortage are not abating. A lot of people, again, were hoping and praying that the industry would see an influx of a lot of new applicants because of this, because that's what they saw out of the Great Recession in 2008. This is not the Great Recession, folks. In fact, saw a factoid from Education Week where I believe the budget deficits that states are facing is like $350 billion or something across the country, where it was only about $230 billion coming out of the Great Recession. So certainly this is a new day, a new age. Regarding the school bus drivers, we actually polled our readers on stnonline.com recently with about 400 web poll votes at this recording, over 85% of folks are telling us that they will need additional school bus drivers for the new school year. And they're basing this on the increases in runs, school bus runs, that are going to be necessary from all of these physical distancing guidelines or recommendations that are reducing the passenger capacity. So Michael Shields will join us in a little bit, and he'll jump into a little bit more of kind of the rationale of what his district has been going through and making some comments kind of on a national level. Some other interesting stats in another recent survey that will actually be in our July issue, nearly 7 out of 10 readers are telling us that they are preparing to transport fewer students. No big surprise, right? We're seeing some big time planned reductions in passenger capacity. Meanwhile, over half of readers are saying they don't have the buses or drivers to accommodate the bell time changes. So that's kind of going right in hand with our web poll. 47% say they don't have a plan yet for screening student health at school bus stops. This has been a very big issue. And a lot of our readers are saying, hey, we don't know how we're going to handle this. Is this going to be something that the school bus drivers have to do? Some of the readers who said they are talking about this and they're trying to develop plans, they are looking to have nurses on each route or some kind of monitor to do these checks. Again, costs are really going, astronomical. How districts are going to pay for all this really remains to be seen. In terms of also protecting the employees, 60% said that they are considering required use of personal protection equipment or PPE by drivers and monitors. The Federal CARES Act has funds that address that. I think a lot of districts right now are just still playing the waiting game, and they're hoping and praying that somehow they'll get some kind of influx of funding from the state or the federal level. And that I think everyone's also hoping that, this phase 2 of COVID-19, at least either number one, never comes. That would be everyone's hope, right? Or number two, that it pushes off maybe a little bit later in the year, so that at least we can get school started again under some semblance of normalcy and then go from there. Thirdly, I think also too, everyone wants a vaccine yesterday, basically, for this thing. So just a lot of people waiting with bated breath to see what the next step is.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And you were pulling up some great data. And last week we did a poll of our subscribers, about 30,000 subscriber base. And wow, we had some amazing response rate. Over 2,359 people responded to our survey last week talking about if they were working or not. So I would say, just based on this data alone, that definitely people are back working. I'm going back into the office, 56.1%. That's 1,324 people. I'm doing a mix of both, going to the office, working from home, 606, which is 25.7%. I'm working from home, 11.7%, 276. And I'm not currently working, about 6.5%, 153. So I would say roughly about 82% or so are they're back at it. And that's a great sample size of what our audience is really facing. And they're really got a task ahead of them, Ryan. There's lots of information out there, and STN is really trying to give them resources to address a lot of the COVID-19 challenges, talk about school restart. We're here for you, School Transportation Nation. So, Ryan, you want to share any other updates, maybe some new resources on the website people could lean into and gather more information?
Yeah, well, certainly we have all our coronavirus articles that you can find, but we've also started a resource page that lists out all of the official released state guidance on restart and reopening. So you can find that in our resources section at the bottom of the website and our footer. You click on safety, and then there'll be some links at the top of the page, and you can find the state guidance for COVID-19. So last we looked, there were over 30 states that had something official. It seems like something new is coming out every day. And even when they do release something, as I mentioned earlier, some of them might be backtracking on some of the things that they were mentioning doing. Again, I think it's really when the rubber is meeting the road on this thing, as they're getting more feedback and districts are really jumping into this thing and seeing how much it's going to cost. Unfortunately, it comes down to money. We always in this industry say, money shouldn't have anything to do with it. But just the realism of the world that we live in, we've got to figure out a way to pay for this stuff. And so that's really, I think, affecting states' decisions. As we get into July, school budgets are really into effect then. We will see what school districts can do and where they can go from there.
Yeah, Ryan, news and information is so vital to our audience these days. And we received some important news from our friends at TransFinder that your district may qualify to open fall 2020 with the world's most powerful web-based routing solution, Route Finder Plus. Experts all agree it's the best way to manage reopening out of the pandemic using routing software that provides features such as what-if scenarios, calendar-based routing, and smart sequencing is key. TransFinder is making this opportunity available for just one more week. So act now by emailing getplus@transfinder.com. That's getplus@transfinder.com. Make sure you put in the subject line STN podcast, be entered to win an Amazon gift card. Plus, they'll make a $10 donation to our favorite charity. Again, getplus@transfinder.com. Route Finder Plus is faster, safer, and smarter, so you can be too. All right, Ryan, you want to give us any more details on other upcoming articles in our July issue that you can preview for us? Maybe give us a little teaser on?
Yeah, sure. Well, we're talking about cleaning and sanitizing and disinfecting and kind of what that all means, like you mentioned. Also, bell times and all the routing. Taylor Hannon, our associate editor, she jumps into that topic. A lot of people, again, have been answering surveys and telling us what they're doing or their challenges. That will enlighten a lot of folks. It's just, it's a whole, don't think of the bell times of the past. Don't have to tell all you readers that. You guys are living it. Things have just changed so much. So that will be a really interesting article, as well as the role that artificial intelligence is potentially playing in this whole thing and how we've really seen that technology come to the forefront in terms of COVID-19 response. When you're talking about artificial intelligence in school transportation, you're thinking a lot more on the routing side, a lot of the software, the video, a lot of AI is the engine that's driving a lot of the automation that we're seeing in logistics and in transportation. Well, and also too, speaking of video, talking to 24/7 security, who there are actually utilizing some of their video expertise and artificial intelligence to look at remote temperature taking of students, perhaps in a school bus, as well as people in other places. There's some infrared technology that's doesn't sound like it's quite mature yet. And there's some concerns from some medical experts about using infrared, but certainly some companies are looking at that right now. So that's an interesting article on the tech side of things to really start seeing how these things are playing toward the future and the things that are going to be potentially available to student transporters. Of course, there's a cost to all this. That's of course a consideration, but very interesting to see where student transportation might go and how the school bus could turn into potentially even a tracing tool to gauge when a student becomes or an employee becomes sick with COVID-19 or something else, that they can actually do contact tracing and see other students or other people that person has come into contact with. So some interesting stuff there, as well as, amid all this COVID-19, the business of student transportation is still moving forward. That includes purchasing new school buses and especially alternative fuel and alternative energy. So also have an article looking at the intricacies of that and why districts continue to go to artificial fuel or energy. Diesel's still winning, but we are seeing that gap starting to close.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think, tying up what your thoughts are, Ryan, we talked a lot about it. Bottom line is, what are parents' willingness to send their kids back to school? The risk level that they're willing to take. What's that tolerance level? Do I feel good about sending my kids to school tomorrow? Don't know about that. I need to hear what the school's plan is and how are schools communicating that plan to the parents, right? And how is that clearly being communicated and how they're going to keep our kids safe? So I think that people are up against that. And if that's cleaning or that's procedures, like you touch on it with the temperature reading, right? We're looking at contactless thermometers, as someone standing outside the bus taking that temp, who does that? What are the policies on that with taking the temperature of minors? What are the nuanced things that we face as an industry that people haven't thought of? And Ryan, the importance of cleanliness and all these safety things are just so vital to school transportation restarting. And I want to bring out this week's safety tip that focuses on just how important cleanliness is on the school bus. And it's brought to you by Say On, a Safe Fleet brand. School is just around the corner. Are your buses COVID clean? Seats, handrails, belts, window screens, and more. They're all part of the pre and post trip inspection as kids head back to school. With the new Safe Fleet vehicle inspection app, you can easily customize your reports to ensure all cleaning is done before the kids get on board. Seon's team have been busy connecting with hundreds of school districts, providing safety solutions for back to school in a world with COVID-19. Check out seon.com/COVID. That's this week's safety tip brought to you by Seon. We're committed to driving safety forward.
Coming up, folks, soon we'll have Michael Shields from Salem Keizer Public Schools in Oregon. But first, turning our attention to Washington, D.C., where the House Democrats last week announced a $1.5 trillion proposal to fund transportation infrastructure. Earlier in the month, they also introduced a $494 billion bill to reauthorize federal transportation funding. And in doing so, they targeted lap shoulder seatbelts in school buses. That issue continues to be really pushed at the federal level, at least in some respects, as well as requiring electronic stability controls and automatic braking for school buses, and among other things, a requirement to have fire suppression systems in school buses, but also an illegal passing campaign and for NHTSA to share findings from research and a survey that they've been doing. That's one bill that was introduced earlier this month. And then last week with this $1.5 trillion proposal, it'll be interesting to see where, if anywhere, this goes. Now, this $1.5 trillion proposal includes the STOP Act, which the industry is supporting, as it would really require a review of state laws and enforcement levels for illegal passing of school buses. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has already voiced his opposition to tying infrastructure into a new COVID-19 stimulus package. Plus, it's a partisan proposal. National School Transportation Association Executive Director Kurt Mackison told me last week that it's not clear if the Senate even wants to take up transportation reauthorization at this time either. Current transportation funding is set to expire on September 30th. So a lot of political wrangling that's continuing to go on amidst this whole COVID-19 thing. Obviously, that's what everyone is finally attuned to. Doesn't seem to be much political appetite right now for anything but COVID-19 and economy stimulus. But it is encouraging, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, that we are seeing school bus and school transportation mentioned in these federal bills. Obviously, there's not a lot of funding tied to that. And, that's something that this industry just has gotten used to. But more and more in terms of advocacy, getting that yellow school bus message out there, and also to the expertise of the industry and the certification and the safety of the drivers and everything that goes into transporting students, and really being the advocates for safety in communities. Because let's face it, not always is school busing an option for a lot of kids, as well as in a lot of districts. Again, coming back to money. So while we want to have every kid on the school bus, sometimes that's not feasible, but it's this whole new way of thinking that COVID-19 is driving, and this necessity to think outside of the box and to develop people relationships and partnerships. That's really, one of the big lessons that seems to be coming out of this. And, expanding upon that will be Michael Shields, our guest from Salem Keizer Schools in Oregon. So stay tuned. Pleased to be joined right now by Michael Shields, the Director of Transportation for Salem Keizer School District in Oregon. He has been in the industry for nearly 50 years, 42 as a director. So he's going to talk to us a lot today about how he sees COVID-19 affecting not only his school district, but the industry nationwide. So Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here, Ryan, Tony. This is an opportunity to share some of the things of what we've learned over our time, and it's welcome for you to have invited me.
Again, it's our pleasure. Those of you who've been to the STN Expo Reno know Michael very well. He's been a trusted advisor and speaker for us over the years. And Michael, you're actually set to retire here in the next couple days.
Yeah, so Ryan, actually December 1st, I retired in the district. We agreed to work through a contract through the end of the year. And then over the next few months, I'll be working on an hourly basis supporting the department because of this COVID thing and bringing in a new director.
Okay. So obviously, yeah. So COVID-19, this has been taking up a lot of your time, I know, in addition to grooming your successor. What is Salem Keizer going through right now and trying to get ready for school startup?
Well, that's an amazing question. Where do we start? One of the things we can count on, Ryan, is every day, the goal and direction changes a little bit based on our health authorities and the governor's offices and those types of things. And now that they're working with in this case, the Oregon Department of Education, as I imagine most school districts are having the same kinds of experiences. So where it starts, I think, is the aspect of, as I shared in another conversation, to get involved early. There's all kinds of conversations in every school district independently about what the classroom's needs are going to be. And our job is to see how we fit into that, provide them parameters in which we can accomplish our mission. And the restrictions are going to be actually with how many students you can put on a bus based on your local health authority's guidance. And so going through that, working very closely with your nurse's office. In Salem, there's an opportunity where Portland, Beaverton, Hillsborough, Ben Lapine, and Eugene and Salem are all working together to have a common instructional model that will then relate to what we can provide for transportation. And then our teams met and we looked across the nation at what was posted about other school districts and what they were doing with social distancing and school bus endeavors. And then we sat down specifically with our nursing team and our people from risk management and reviewed those options and made a decision about the social distancing to try to keep our employees as safe as possible and to try to provide comfort and reassurance to parents and what we could do to provide that service to kids. The next thing we needed to look at, Ryan, was special education. And so there's students out there that perhaps have partial days. What do I mean by that? That instead of starting at 7:30 in the morning, they don't come in until 9:30. So then we worked through that. What do we do to provide service? We can't necessarily say no, depending on what type of model comes out. So we worked with our special education folks to determine what kind of language we would provide in response, because we don't know yet what services will be provided, even though the IEPs are already completed. Along with that, then there's students that have bus protocols for medical, for behavioral, for emotional issues. And so then we had to have a discussion with not only our medical folks, but our folks in special education. Another person in the special education office reached out to our district's attorneys to say, well, how do we frame that up? What do we do so we're in keeping with providing the student with the maximum service, but you're going to have these concerns about close proximity or the behavioral disordered student that has certain restraint requirements that are provided, or your adult support folks that normally sit with a student. How do we all work through that? So you go into depth, getting the people to the table that have the appropriate information and feedback to frame your service level. So that's kind of what we've done so far. And then from that, the district formed a task force, and then there was subcommittees. And so the overall task force, made up of department heads, they subdivided that into 4 committees. And so there were a face-to-face instructional model, a hybrid model, which was face-to-face and distance learning, a distance learning model, and a flexible model that parents might choose from. Each of those committees explored the opportunities of how we would provide service. In our case, I invited myself through appropriate channels onto 2 of those committees so that we'd be able to provide input so that we wouldn't create a classroom instruction model that was impossible for us to provide the service. So one of the things in my journey in my career, my boss teases me about it, is I've had to learn how not to say no, but to frame things up based on what you can do. And so, for example, not related to COVID, but if a principal wanted to change a bell time, I don't tell the principal no. I tell that program or principal it's going to cost $1 million and 50 drivers, and I turn that into the executive administration. And of course, then realistically, they're not going to say, well, we're going to spend another $1 million. But if they decide to do that, then we work with them on what that runway is, how far out it's going to take to provide that service. So COVID is much the same way if you get yourself involved in the front side of that. And most school districts are already into this. They're already making these decisions and the inclusion model. But how do you get there? I think, again, one of the experiences, and I shared this with Ryan and Tony earlier, was the fact that it's about relationships. It's about how people feel about you and building that credibility before you get to these instances. All of us have experienced some kind of crisis, whether it's floods or fires or snowstorms or et cetera. The transportation responds quickly and effectively and efficiently, because often most departments I've seen are pretty well oiled in responding to crisis. And this is a crisis that's unprecedented in its scope and magnitude. And so thinking through those aspects, I think one of the most important things for us to do is how do we keep our people safe and how do we have those kids and parents feel comfortable. I also met with every program that we provide service for. So we have a preschool coordinator. And so we sat down to talk about what their needs are going to be next year and what services that they're looking at, what classroom changes they'd be making. I sat down with the McKinney-Vento, which is the oversees the homeless area, and they expect to see 100% increase. Well, in Salem Keizer right now, we transport 400 students that are homeless, and can you imagine if that goes to 800? Last year, I bought 9 vans to keep up with some of the kids that are going as many as 60 and 70 miles away from Salem. So the scope of that, if that doubles, is just hard to put our heads around. And I met, as I mentioned earlier, with this people in special education, 2 different folks in 2 different areas, one regular transportation service and the other in the IDA 504 disabilities area. So know who your players are in your district, sit down, meet with them, have conversations with them, take a look at what services you're going to need to provide. I've met with our risk manager and our emergency services folks to talk about what our scope of service levels are going to be. So those are some initial thoughts, Ryan. I'm sure that there's more questions.
Well, I was going to ask you, one of the big things that's on everyone's mind right now is how much reduction in passenger capacity is going to happen. Imagine you guys have had those conversations. What's that looking like for your school buses come the new school year?
Well, great question. Our state identified 35 square feet for classroom. That on a large capacity, 78, 84 passenger bus is about 10 kids. If you look at the 6-foot distance capacity, you're looking at 10 or 12 kids. If you look at the transit district, which is somewhere around the 3 feet distance, you're looking at in the range of somewhere between 18 and 25 kids. And then our state also put on there in our parameters, it's really important that you get the parameters that are available at your district office and read those thoroughly and look for the implications it has. And in Oregon, there's a segment on transportation. And if a student is sick en route, then we need to provide a 6-foot distance during that route time. So then that drops our passenger capacity. Let's say we could do 25 kids a bus if it were 3 feet distance. Now we've got to do 20 because we've got to have a seat available in the event a student is ill. So our big buses are going to be about a 20 capacity. The small and medium buses, we're looking at 4 to 8 capacity. And then you need to look at your general district impact on what your average load is. And so that's going to cut our average load about 50% on average for our bus service. And some runs that may be only a third of the kids we're able to transport. On our small buses, we're looking at about 60% of what it was before. So it's an interesting conundrum, and that's at the 10,000 foot level, because we can't go further into our route planning until we understand what the parameters are going to be based on their classroom needs and what they decide. We also have to look through your rules at the state level, and if you have some mandates that in Oregon that transportation is a part of the educational program, and I think California and Washington it is optional whether you want to provide that service or not. So you need to know what your state rules are when you go to look at what your recommendations are going to be.
You mentioned, a conundrum. I think that's the understatement of the century. Is it, 49 years basically in the industry. I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say that, or to position this question that is this the worst crisis you've seen in terms of what student transportation has had to deal with?
Gosh, that's a great way to frame that question, Ryan. I'm going to answer it in two formats. It is not the worst in terms of immediate life impact. You can have floods or fires or those kinds of things that could have immediate disastrous results on people's lives that you have to respond to. So in that context, no. But in context of proportion of magnitude, this is the largest event that I've ever seen, the most unprecedented and unexpected in what we're able to do. I mean, who knew this whole thing with learning how to do virtual meetings and learning how to keep your staff busy from a distance, learning how to think differently, where you might be able to pop up out of your desk and just go have a quick minute chat with somebody. You have to look at that whole thing differently. So in a global sense, I've never seen anything impact the entire United States, alone, the entire world. One of the interesting things that it's showing me, Ryan, is what we need to do is every district right now is creating their own plan. And it would be interesting now that we've walked through this to have an industry think to say, what have we learned from this experience and where can we have a clearinghouse in the event that we have these type of national proportions to deal with in the future.
It'll be interesting. We have this STARTS task force that NAPT, NSTA, and NASDIPs have formulated, and they're supposed to be coming out in a matter of weeks with at least some actionable items, but rightly so. It's like, how do we implement those? And they've already said a lot of districts aren't going to be able to implement them because they're literally going back to school now. Certainly, there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from this. And speaking of which, as we close out our conversation, again, back to your experience in the industry and kind of looking forward as you retire. You're huge on people. You're huge on professional development. You touched upon it a little bit. But are we seeing from this crisis of, crazy magnitude, are we seeing this developing a new type of leader and perhaps instilling skills that can really help propel this industry forward? How do you see that shaping up?
Wow, that's a great question. I hadn't given that some thought prior to this. So, my style, I can wing that, Ryan. But
good.
I want to be considerate of folks. I see this. Our industry is the reason I moved from the private sector into this segment. I was a couple years in the newspaper business and a year in the food service business, and got into this and just fell in love with it, as many people do. And so one of the things, we are highly relational in our thinking and the way we develop our folks. This is going to take us to a new level of strategic thinkers and problem solvers, where our natural progression in the past has been a bus driver or mechanic moving up in the ranks. And if that's to occur, my advice to the future folks that want to be directors in transportation is to broaden your scope of thinking. It isn't really how well you manage students and how well you drive a bus anymore. It's going to be how well your thinking is around a business model and a platform that's going to be different than what you've had experiences in. And so you mentioned earlier, I think the hugest thing that folks can do is invest in themselves, continue your education, attend the conferences, learn. As I sent something to you guys and some of the feedback I got from my retirement, my biggest takeaway wasn't how well we run our business or what our data scope looks like. Most of it was how people felt about the way I had treated them in the relationship area, and whether they felt heard, whether they felt listened to, whether they felt supported. And so I think we're going to have to think differently of how that looks. And what we're doing every week, our supervisors are reaching out to every driver to make phone calls. And we're not successful on that with everybody. Some folks aren't picking up the phone and we're not connecting, but they're making that effort to stay in touch. Where we'd have a once a month meeting with me virtually or in person, now we're doing a virtual meeting. We're trying to do that every week. We also invited our chief of operations, our chief financial officer. He's run in the last 2 meetings so that our people felt heard and felt connected with a larger scope in the district. So that's how I see some of the things changing moving forward on the business side.
What about on safety? And we'll kind of close it with that. Obviously, we've seen a whole flood of new things introduced into school transportation in terms of not just cleaning the bus once a week or once a month anymore to make it look good or clean up a spill from a student, but we're talking about disinfecting buses. We're talking about barriers on buses, which, a lot of states are weighing in. And then the STARTS task force has said, well, hold on a second. This could be put you out of compliance with FMVSS 222. But in terms of all the safety that's going into this, the temperature checks and everything, how do you see this affecting the industry going forward? Of course, we don't know how long we're going to be living with COVID-19. We hear that a vaccination is probably at least a year away. But I've also read an article recently that there could actually be something bigger that could hit us, beyond this COVID-19. How do you see this kind of a whole experience shaping the safety angle that's already so important to this industry?
Well, we'll start with the cleaning aspect you mentioned. I think deferring to our professionals in that area, we are in Salem, we're not going to call it disinfecting because the level of the cleanliness to sanitize and disinfect it, you can't reach the hospital surgical room level. So whether the term is deep cleaning or what term we need to look at some definitions of what that is so we don't find ourselves in a place that we're not able to accomplish that term. I see a whole generation of kids that automatically are going to learn to wash their hands and cough in their elbow. I'm seeing some differences in my grandchildren, one set versus another. The ones that have been impacted with the COVID and they're at home more and haven't interacted with kids as much and other people as much, they're a little more timid, a little more distant because of, not stranger danger, but certainly that distance. So how do we work through that with kids as we look at the safety angle so kids are going to feel comfortable once we get into some type of face-to-face contact? I think how people view our business is going to need to be changed a bit and a little more flexible. We've always been flexible, but flexible in our thinking more than our actions. So when we look at our safety, it's going to get down to talking about what do we do to encourage kids' behavior at bus stops. The whole bullying thing may take on a different look that we haven't even thought about. And so to keep kids safe, what do we do to consider that as well?
It's always enlightening to talk to you, Michael. I really appreciate this. As you retire, let's stay in touch. I look forward to our conversations, and thank you again for sharing your wisdom with our listeners today. Well,
I so enjoy the times that you and I have a chance to talk, and it's always enlightening, and I always learn something from you, and I'm so grateful and appreciative of that.
Well, I appreciate you. Thanks so much, Michael.
Stay healthy and safe.
Hey, thanks, Ryan and Michael, for that super insightful conversation. We hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to email us at info@stnmedia.com to tell us what your thoughts are on this week's episode of the podcast. You can stream, subscribe, or share this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, visit us on stnonline.com so you can stay updated on all the latest news and discussions on school transportation. And I also want to extend a special thank you to our sponsors, TransFinder, Zonar, and Safely. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.